Poor Amish man married fat widow for a horse. On wedding night, she locked the door. A poor Amish man, desperate for survival, makes a deal no one in town can believe. He marries a fat widow just to get a horse. The church bell tolls, the papers are signed, and whispers follow them down the dusty street. But when the wedding night falls, he reaches her door and finds it locked. This was never meant to be a marriage of love. She only wanted a name to protect her ranch. He only wanted a horse to survive. But under the lamplight, as neighbors mock them and the railroad circles like a wolf, a hidden truth rises. Her land holds the only spring for miles, and his vow is the only thing standing in the way of losing it all. Thunder of hooves, jailhouse keys rattling, her tears behind a locked door. His prayer whispered in chains. What happens when a sham marriage becomes the only hope for justice, dignity, and love? Every time I see your comments, I'm reminded how stories connect us across distances, backgrounds, and hearts. If values like respect, courage, and compassion still guide you, then you're part of this story too. Through the dusty streets of Animas Forks, Mark Yoder trudged beside his thin mule, his boots scuffing the packed earth. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows between the weathered buildings of the Colorado mountain town. His shoulders ached from days of walking, and his once neat black cotton shirt was gray with trail dust. The livery stable's wooden walls creaked in the wind as Mark approached. The sharp scent of hay and horse manure filled his nostrils, familiar yet somehow foreign here in this strange western town. His mule's ribs showed beneath its dull coat. They'd shared what little food he could afford on the long journey from Pennsylvania. Inside the dim stable, Mark blinked to adjust his eyes. Several men lounged on hay bales, their conversation echoing off the rough-hewn beams overhead. A woman's determined footsteps approached from outside. "Here comes the widow Kincaid with her eggs again," one man muttered, just loud enough to be heard. "Lord above, she fills a doorway like a wagon," another added with a snicker. Mark turned to see a stout woman in a faded blue cotton dress stride through the stable doors, her chin held high despite the cruel words. She carried a basket of eggs with capable hands that spoke of hard work. Though her face was set in stern lines, something in her eyes betrayed a deep hurt. "Morning, Mrs. Kincaid," the livery owner called out, his tone carefully neutral. "Brought your usual dozen for trade?" "2 dozen today, Mr. Miller," she replied, her voice sharp as a whip crack. "And I'll thank you to mind your own business about what fills doorways." The men fell silent, but their smirks remained. Mark felt his chest tighten at their unkindness. His ma had taught him better than to mock anyone, especially a widow making her way alone. Keeping his eyes lowered respectfully, Mark approached the livery owner. "Sir, I'm seeking work in exchange for a horse. I can't offer money, but I'm strong and know horses well." Mr. Miller shook his head. "No charity cases here, friend. Cash only for horseflesh." Mark's heart sank. Without a horse, he couldn't work the ranches or farms around here. Without work, he couldn't earn money for a horse. The bitter taste of failure, so familiar from his lost Pennsylvania farm, filled his mouth. He noticed the widow Kincaid had paused in her egg counting, her head tilted slightly as she listened. Suddenly she turned to face him, her green eyes sharp and assessing. "Marry me," she said boldly, "and you'll have a horse by sundown." The stable fell silent as a tomb. Mark stared at her, wondering if the mountain air had addled his hearing. But no. She stood straight and proud, waiting for his answer. His mind whirled. Marriage was sacred, not to be entered lightly. Yet he had prayed for guidance, for any sign of God's will in this strange land. Could this unexpected offer be an answer? Mark closed his eyes briefly, lifting up a silent prayer. When he opened them, peace settled in his heart, despite the strangeness of the situation. "Yes, ma'am," he said quietly. "If you're certain." She nodded once sharply. "I am. The church is this way." Whispers and snickers followed them as they walked down the town's main street. Mark noticed how the widow's shoulders stiffened at each laugh, but she never slowed her determined pace. The church was a simple clapboard building with a small cross mounted above its door. Inside, cool shadows wrapped around the few wooden pews. The preacher, a thin man with kind eyes, listened to their request with obvious concern. "Mrs. Kincaid, are you sure about this?" he asked gently. "I'm sure, Reverend Wheeler," she replied. "I need a man who can work, and he needs a horse. It's a fair trade." The Reverend looked at Mark. "And you, young man, this is no small thing you're agreeing to." "I believe the Lord guides our paths," Mark said softly. "I'll be a good husband to her." The ceremony was brief and stark. No flowers adorned the altar, no music filled the air. Only the afternoon sunlight streaming through plain glass windows witnessed their vows. Mark's voice remained steady as he promised to love and honor this stranger who was becoming his wife. He noticed her hands trembled slightly as she spoke her own vows, though her voice never wavered. "I now pronounce you man and wife," Reverend Wheeler said solemnly. "May God bless your union." Outside the church, townsfolk had gathered to whisper and point. Some laughed openly at the odd couple, the tall, lean Amish man and the stout widow. Mark felt Chloe stiffen beside him again, but he simply offered her his arm as his pa had taught him was proper. After a moment's hesitation, she took it. They walked to the livery stable, where Chloe led him to a sturdy roan gelding. The horse's coat gleamed with good care, and intelligence shone in its dark eyes. "This was James's horse," she said, her voice catching slightly on her late husband's name. "Treat him well." Mark ran a gentle hand down the horse's neck. "I will. You have my word." The sun was setting as they mounted their horses, Mark on the roan, Chloe on her own bay mare. His thin mule followed behind, tied to his saddle. The town's laughter faded as they rode into the gathering dusk. Ahead, a warm yellow light glowed in a distant window. Chloe's ranch, Mark assumed, his new home. The thought both terrified and comforted him. He didn't love this woman yet, but he respected her courage and determination. Perhaps in time they could build something real from this strange beginning. They rode in silence, the horses' hooves raising small clouds of dust in the twilight. The mountains loomed dark against the purple sky, and a cool wind carried the scent of pine and sage. Mark noticed how Chloe sat her horse with easy confidence despite her size. There was strength in her, he realized, not just in body, but in spirit. The lamplight in her kitchen window grew brighter as they approached. Mark studied what he could see of the ranch in the failing light. A solid house built of local stone and timber, a barn that needed minor repairs, corrals that wanted mending. Good land, he thought, but showing signs of a widow's struggle to keep up with all the work alone. They dismounted in the barnyard and Mark efficiently began caring for the horses. He could feel Chloe watching him, perhaps wondering if she'd made a mistake. But his sure movements with the animals seemed to satisfy her, and she turned toward the house. "There's stew on the stove," she said, her voice gruff but not unkind. "Once you've settled the horses, come in and eat." Mark nodded, grateful for her practical approach to their unusual situation. As he curried the roan gelding, he said another silent prayer of thanks. The Lord worked in mysterious ways, his ma had always said. Perhaps this strange marriage was part of his plan after all. The gelding's coat gleamed in the lantern light as Mark finished his work. He patted the horse's neck one last time, then headed toward the house where his new wife waited. Whatever came next, he would face it with faith and honest effort. The kitchen door creaked as he opened it, and warmth from the cook stove wrapped around him like a blessing. Chloe stood at the stove, stirring the promised stew, her back straight and her movements efficient. She had removed her bonnet, revealing dark hair streaked with gray and pinned severely at her neck. "Wash up at the pump outside," she said without turning around. "There's soap and a towel on the bench." Mark did as she asked, the cold water refreshing after the dusty day. When he returned, she had set 2 bowls on the solid wooden table. Steam rose from them, carrying the savory scent of beef and vegetables. They sat down across from each other, these 2 strangers bound now by words spoken before God. Mark bowed his head and offered a silent grace. When he looked up, he saw Chloe watching him with an unreadable expression. The stew was good, rich with flavor that spoke of skill in the kitchen. They ate in silence, but it wasn't entirely uncomfortable. Through the window, the mountain darkness settled deep and vast around their small island of lamplight. Mark studied his new wife covertly as they ate. Despite her hard exterior, he saw how carefully she had prepared the meal, how clean she kept her home. These were the signs of a woman who took pride in her work, who hadn't let grief make her careless. When they finished eating, he stood and began to clear the table without being asked. A fleeting look of surprise crossed Chloe's face, followed by something that might have been approval. "There's a bedroom upstairs," she said abruptly. "I sleep down here, we'll sort out the rest tomorrow." Mark nodded, understanding her need for space and privacy. "Thank you," he said simply. "For the meal. For everything." She looked away, but he saw her shoulders relax slightly. "Well," she said gruffly, "we both got what we needed, didn't we? Get some rest. Morning comes early on a ranch." He climbed the narrow stairs to the room she'd mentioned, carrying his small pack of belongings. The room was clean but sparse, with a narrow bed and a window that looked out over the moonlit pastures. Mark knelt beside the bed and prayed for guidance in this new life he'd chosen. Below, he could hear Chloe moving about the kitchen, the familiar sounds of a woman setting her household in order for the night. His wife, he reminded himself with a touch of wonder. The Lord did indeed work in mysterious ways. The wooden floorboards creaked beneath their feet as Chloe led Mark through the narrow entry of her ranch house. The lingering sense of bacon grease and wood smoke spoke of earlier meals, of a life lived alone until now. A single oil lamp cast dancing shadows on the walls, illuminating worn but clean furnishings. "Kitchen's through there," Chloe said, gesturing with a short wave of her hand. "Pumps out back for water. Privy's behind the barn." Her words came out clipped and businesslike, as if she were explaining things to a hired hand rather than a new husband. Mark nodded, taking in the modest surroundings. The house was small but solid, built to withstand mountain winters. His carpenter's eye noted the sturdy craftsmanship of the door frames, the careful joining of the floorboards. "Spare rooms up here," Chloe continued, starting up the narrow stairs. Each step groaned under her weight, but Mark noticed how she moved with surprising grace for a woman of her size. At the top, she pushed open a door to reveal a small chamber with a single bed. Dust motes danced in the lamplight streaming through the window. But Mark didn't follow her up. Instead, he set his worn leather bag down near the front door, its meager contents making barely a sound as it settled on the floor. Chloe's eyebrows drew together. "What are you doing?" "I am your husband," Mark said quietly. "It wouldn't be right to sleep apart on our wedding night." A flash of something, fear, anger, crossed Chloe's face. Without another word, she descended the stairs and walked briskly to her bedroom door. It closed with a sharp click of the lock. Mark stood for a moment in the quiet house, then approached her door. He knocked softly, his knuckles barely grazing the worn wood. "I am your husband now," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "We made vows before God today." "This wasn't about love, Mark." Chloe's voice cut through the door like a knife. "I needed a man's name on papers. That's all. Don't come scratching at my door like some desperate tomcat." Mark stood very still, absorbing her words. The rejection stung, but he kept his dignity. "As you wish," he said finally. "Good night, Chloe." He retrieved his bag and stepped out onto the porch. The night air was cool and crisp, carrying the sweet scent of pine from the surrounding mountains. Mark shrugged off his coat, plain and dark, like all his clothes, and laid it carefully on the wooden planks. Settling down, he gazed up at the star-filled sky. Coyotes yipped in the distant hills, their wild songs echoing across the valley. Mark closed his eyes and began to whisper the words of Psalm 23, finding comfort in their familiar rhythm. "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want," he murmured. "He maketh me to lie down in green pastures." The ancient words carried him through the long night. Dawn came early, painting the mountains in shades of rose and gold. Mark was already up, having washed at the pump and straightened his clothes as best he could. He studied the ranch in the growing light, noting all that needed attention. The corral rails sagged badly, worn by weather and neglect. Mark found tools in the barn, a hammer, nails, some spare lumber that would serve. He set to work with the quiet efficiency that marked all his movements. His hands knew this work well. Back in Pennsylvania, he had maintained all the fences on his family's farm until he pushed the painful memory aside, focusing instead on each strike of the hammer, each rail set true and strong. The sun climbed higher as he worked. He heard movement from the house, the back door opening, the clatter of pots, the snap of kindling being added to the cook stove. But Chloe didn't come out. Mark continued his work, moving steadily along the corral. His plain black hat shaded his eyes from the strengthening sun, and his suspenders stretched with each movement as he lifted and positioned the heavy rails. The sound of hoofbeats made him look up. A small group of riders approached along the dirt road that passed the ranch. They slowed as they drew near, and Mark could hear their low whistles of surprise. "Well, would you look at that?" one man said, not bothering to lower his voice. "Widow Kincaid's place is getting some attention at last." "Heard she married some Amish fellow yesterday," another replied. "Desperate times call for desperate measures, I reckon." Mark kept working, letting their words roll past him like water. He'd heard worse in his time, and their opinion meant nothing compared to doing what was right. The riders moved on, but their passing left a change in the air. Through the kitchen window, Mark caught a glimpse of Chloe standing very still, her hands gripping the edge of the sink. Her face was turned away, but he could see the tension in her shoulders. She had wanted his name on paper, she'd said. Wanted it to keep people away, he realized now. Instead, their unusual marriage was drawing more attention than ever to her ranch. The thought troubled him, but he pushed it aside and returned to his work. The corral wouldn't fix itself. By mid-morning, the worst of the sagging rails were repaired. Mark stepped back to check his work, satisfaction warming him despite his uncertainty about his place here. The corral stood strong now, ready for whatever stock Chloe might need to pen. The kitchen door opened and Chloe emerged with 2 tin cups of coffee. She walked toward him with determined steps, her skirts brushing the dusty ground. Her face was set in its usual stern lines, but something uncertain flickered in her eyes as she held out one of the cups. "Didn't ask you to fix that," she said gruffly. "No," Mark agreed, accepting the coffee with a small nod of thanks. But it needed doing. They stood in awkward silence, sipping the strong, bitter coffee. The morning sun cast their shadows long across the yard, his tall and lean, hers shorter and solid. 2 strangers bound by desperate choices trying to find their way forward. "There's eggs and bacon inside," Chloe said finally. "Can't have you falling off the corral from hunger." She turned and walked back to the house, her steps quick and sharp. Mark watched her go, noting how she held her head high despite her discomfort. There was pride there, he thought, but also fear. Fear of what? He wasn't yet sure. But he would wait patiently, doing what needed to be done until she was ready to tell him. He finished his coffee and set the cup aside. There was more work waiting. He could see loose shingles on the barn roof, a gate hanging crooked on its hinges, weeds threatening to overwhelm the kitchen garden. All things he could fix with time and care. Inside the house, he heard Chloe moving about, the sounds of her solitary life now shared, however reluctantly, with him. He sent up another silent prayer for guidance, then picked up his hammer and moved on to the next task. Sometimes he knew the only way forward was through honest work and patient faith. The morning light strengthened, promising another hot day in the Colorado mountains. More riders passed on the road, each slowing to stare at the changes already visible at the widow's ranch. Mark kept working, steady and sure, while behind the kitchen window Chloe watched with growing unease as her plan to keep the world at bay began to unravel. The next morning dawned clear and cool. Inside the kitchen, Chloe moved with sharp, quick motions as she prepared breakfast. The cast-iron skillet clattered against the stovetop harder than necessary as she dropped in thick slices of salt pork. Mark entered quietly from the porch where he'd spent another night under the stars. His clothes were neat despite sleeping rough, and he'd already washed at the pump outside. The morning light caught the silver threading through his dark beard. "Morning," he said softly, standing near the doorway. Chloe barely glanced his way. "Sit then," she said, gesturing curtly at the worn table. "No sense letting it get cold." She set out 2 tin plates, each bearing a generous helping of fried salt pork, cornbread, and beans left from yesterday. The portions were large. She'd always been a hearty cook, no matter what folks said about her size. "Thank you," Mark said, settling into one of the straight-backed chairs. His manners were impeccable, but Chloe noticed he ate sparingly, taking small bites and leaving most of his portion untouched. "Food not to your liking?" she asked sharply, more defensive than she meant to sound. Mark looked up, his eyes steady and kind. "The meal is fine, I'm just used to plain fare. My people believe in simple living." Chloe snorted softly but said nothing more. She watched as he finished what little he would eat, then cleaned his plate and fork in the wash basin. Without a word, he took his hat from its peg and headed outside. Through the window, she watched him survey the overgrown fence line. The morning sun cast long shadows as he fetched tools from the barn, a scythe and some rough work gloves he'd found. Soon, the steady swish-swish of the blade cutting through tall weeds filled the air. Mark worked methodically, moving down the fence line with quiet purpose. His movements were efficient, nothing wasted. By mid-morning, sweat darkened his shirt, but his pace never slackened. The fence slowly emerged from its tangle of weeds and grass. The days passed in similar fashion. Mark slept on the porch, rose before dawn, and worked from sunup to sundown. Chloe maintained her distance, but she couldn't help noticing how the ranch was changing. Broken things were mended, weeds disappeared, order slowly returned to what had become wild and neglected. A week after their strange wedding, Chloe hitched up her wagon for the trip into town. She needed supplies from the mercantile: flour, coffee, sugar, and some new lamp oil. Mark accompanied her, riding the roan gelding that had been their marriage price. The mercantile's bell jangled as Chloe pushed through the door. The familiar scents of leather, tobacco, and coffee beans filled the air. She moved purposefully through the aisles, gathering what she needed while trying to ignore the whispers that followed her. Near the pickle barrel, several men lounged, making no effort to lower their voices. "Well, if it ain't Widow Kincaid," one said with a smirk. "Though I reckon we can't call her widow no more." "Heard she bought herself a husband with a horse," another added with a harsh laugh. "Desperate times, eh?" Chloe's hands tightened on her basket. "Mind your own business," she snapped, but her voice wavered slightly. "What's the matter, Chloe?" the first man called out. "Truth too heavy for you to bear? Speaking of heavy..." He elbowed his companion, both of them guffawing at the crude reference to her size. Mark had been examining some tools near the back of the store. Now he stepped forward, his movements unhurried but purposeful. He positioned himself between Chloe and the men, his presence somehow filling the space despite his quiet demeanor. "You'll speak kindly in my wife's presence," he said. His voice was calm but carried an unmistakable note of authority. "Or you won't speak at all." The store fell silent. The men by the pickle barrel shifted uncomfortably, their earlier bravado withering under Mark's steady gaze. One opened his mouth as if to reply, then thought better of it. Chloe stood very still, her heart pounding. She couldn't remember the last time anyone had defended her, not since Thomas died, leaving her alone to face the town's judgment and cruel remarks. The feeling of having someone stand up for her was both foreign and achingly familiar. "Mr. Wilson," Mark addressed the store owner, his tone perfectly civil, "we'll take our goods now." The storekeeper hurried to wrap their purchases, eager to break the tension. Mark paid with coins from his pocket, plain Amish leather, worn smooth with use. He carried their packages to the wagon himself, helping Chloe up to the seat with grave courtesy before mounting his horse. They rode home in silence, but something had shifted between them. The afternoon sun was sinking toward the mountains when they arrived back at the ranch. While Mark tended to the horses, Chloe went inside and began preparing supper without being asked. She made a pot of beans with salt pork and baked fresh biscuits in the oven. The familiar tasks helped settle her still jangled nerves. When Mark came in from the barn, she had 2 places set at the table. They ate without speaking, but the silence felt different now, less hostile, more contemplative. The sound of their forks against the tin plates filled the kitchen with a homey rhythm that spoke of shared space and common purpose. It wasn't exactly companionship, but it was something more than the bitter distance of before. After the dishes were done, Mark took his worn German Bible from his coat pocket and settled in the chair near the lamp. The leather binding was soft with age and use, the pages well thumbed. His voice was low and melodious as he read in his native tongue, the strange words somehow soothing in the gathering darkness. Chloe had retreated to her bedroom as usual, but she left the door slightly ajar. Through the crack, she could see Mark's profile in the lamplight as he read. She didn't understand the words, but something about the cadence spoke to her heart, of faith perhaps, or simple endurance in the face of life's hardships. The lamp's glow flickered on the walls as night settled over the ranch. Outside, a coyote called lonely in the hills, and somewhere in the barn, a horse stamped softly. Inside, Mark's voice continued steady and sure, while Chloe lay in her bed, not listening but hearing all the same. It wasn't love or even friendship yet, but it was something. Something real taking root in the space between two wounded souls who had made a bargain neither quite understood. Something that might, with time and patience, grow into more than either had expected. The German words washed over her as sleep approached. Chloe didn't know what they meant, but she recognized the tone of reverence, of quiet certainty in something larger than oneself. It was the first night since Thomas died that she didn't feel entirely alone. The late summer days stretched long and golden across the Colorado mountains. Mark rose before the sun each morning, padding quietly across the creaking porch boards where he still made his bed. The first pale light would find him already at work, his steady hands bringing order back to Chloe's neglected ranch. In the cool dawn hours, he mucked out the barn, his pitchfork moving in steady rhythm. The horses nickered softly as he worked, growing used to his gentle presence. He kept their stalls clean and sweet-smelling with fresh straw, remembering the ways his father had taught him back in Pennsylvania. When the morning sun climbed higher, he turned to mending fences. The work was endless, posts rotted or leaning, rails split and weathered. Mark worked methodically, section by section, his hands remembering the skills learned on his family's farm. The sound of his hammer echoed across the pastures, steady as a heartbeat. The woodpile grew as Mark swung his axe, the clean crack of splitting logs punctuating the afternoon air. Sweat darkened his shirt, but his pace never slackened. Each evening found the pile a little higher, insurance against the coming winter. From her kitchen window, Chloe watched his ceaseless industry. Her lips pressed thin, refusing to acknowledge how the ranch was changing under his care. But her eyes traced the newly straightened fence lines, the tidy barn, the growing woodpile. The place looked less abandoned with each passing day, less like a widow's failing holding. She still kept her distance, speaking little beyond what was necessary, but she found herself cooking larger meals, setting out coffee and bread in the morning before Mark began his work. If he noticed these small concessions, he made no mention of them. He simply ate what was offered, thanked her quietly, and went about his tasks. One morning, as Mark repaired a gate hinge and Chloe gathered eggs from the henhouse, the sound of hoofbeats drew their attention. 3 riders approached from the east, their horses moving at an unhurried walk. As they drew closer, Chloe recognized the lead rider, Greyhawk, a Ute elder who had often traded with her late husband, Thomas. Mark straightened from his work, watching as the small party drew up to the fence. Greyhawk sat his horse with the easy grace of a lifetime horseman, his face weathered by years and wisdom. A younger man and woman rode with him, their expressions reserved but not unfriendly. "Welcome," Chloe called out, walking toward the fence. Her voice held cautious respect. Thomas had always spoken highly of Greyhawk's honor and fairness. "It has been many moons since you visited our ranch." Greyhawk inclined his head slightly. "Many changes since then," he said, his English clear but accented. His dark eyes moved to Mark. "You have taken a new husband." "This is Mark Yoder," Chloe said, gesturing. "He came from the east." Mark stepped forward, ducking his head respectfully. "You are welcome here," he said simply. Greyhawk studied him for a long moment, then dismounted with fluid grace despite his years. The younger couple followed suit. Chloe invited them to sit in the shade of the porch, bringing out cups of coffee and some fresh bread. They sat in comfortable silence for a few moments, following the old ways that valued thoughtful speech over hasty words. Finally, Greyhawk spoke, his voice carrying the weight of warning. "We come to tell you of trouble brewing," he said. The iron horse pushes west. He used the common native term for the railroad. Their men have been surveying the land, marking the water sources. Mark leaned forward slightly, his face serious. They seek water rights? Greyhawk nodded gravely. They make promises to our people, speak of treaties and agreements. But their words are like smoke. They drift away on the wind. His weathered hand gestured toward the distant hills. Already they ignore the boundaries set by past treaties. What they want, they take. The younger man spoke up, his voice bitter. They say the water belongs to no one, but when they claim it, suddenly it belongs only to them. Watch your boundaries carefully, Greyhawk advised. What they take from us, they will take from you. The thirst for power knows no limits. Mark nodded slowly, feeling a deep kinship with their plight. Had he not lost his own family farm to powerful men who cared nothing for tradition or right? The railroad's hunger for land and resources was no different from the banks that had swallowed up so many small farms back east. Chloe sat very still, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The warning struck deep, touching fears she had tried to ignore. Her late husband had chosen this land carefully, making sure their water rights were legally recorded. But what good were papers against the railroad's power? The visitors did not stay long. Before leaving, Greyhawk pressed a small bundle wrapped in soft leather into Mark's hands. "For your kindness in listening," he said. Inside were dried herbs and medicines known to the Ute people. Mark accepted the gift with proper gravity, understanding it marked the beginning of friendship. They watched the three riders disappear into the lengthening afternoon shadows. Neither Mark nor Chloe spoke for a long while, each lost in their own thoughts. The sun sank lower, painting the mountains in deep purple and gold. That evening, after the chores were done, they sat together at the kitchen table. A single lamp cast warm light in the gathering darkness. For the first time since their strange marriage began, Chloe spoke of what lay heavy on her heart. "The railroad has been buying up land all through the valley," she said quietly, her eyes fixed on her hands. "Thomas, my first husband, he always said our water rights were secure. But now—" She trailed off, the fear evident in her voice. Mark sat silent for a moment, choosing his words carefully. "I lost my family's farm to powerful men," he said finally. "They cared nothing for generations of work, for what was right, only for profit." He looked at her steadily across the table. "I will not stand idle while the same thing happens here." Chloe raised her eyes to his face, studying him in the lamplight. His expression held the same quiet sincerity she had come to know in these past days. No dramatic promises, just simple, steadfast determination. "This marriage began as a bargain," she said slowly. "You owed me nothing beyond the name on paper." "I am your husband," Mark replied simply. "Whatever comes, we face it together." Something shifted in Chloe's chest. Not love, not yet, but perhaps the beginning of trust. She found herself believing him, this quiet man who worked so steadily, who met both mockery and threats with the same calm dignity. Later, when she retired to her bedroom, she left the door slightly ajar. It was a small gesture, barely noticeable. Mark made no move to cross that threshold, maintaining his place on the porch as always. But something had changed between them. A crack in the wall of Chloe's defenses, a tentative step toward true partnership. Outside, crickets sang in the darkness. A cool breeze carried the scent of sage and pine through the open window. Chloe lay awake for a long time, thinking of water rights and railroad men, of quiet strength and promises kept. For the first time since Thomas died, she felt less alone in facing whatever storms might come. A week of peaceful routine settled over the ranch. Mark rose each dawn to tend the animals, while Chloe kept the household running with quiet efficiency. Though they still lived more as strangers than spouses, a tentative understanding had grown between them. The morning started like any other. Chloe stood at her kitchen window watching Mark split wood in the yard. The steady thunk of his axe echoed across the homestead. A cloud of dust on the horizon caught her eye, a lone rider approaching on a sleek bay horse. As the rider drew closer, Chloe's hands tightened on her apron. The man's fine suit and polished boots marked him as no local rancher. He carried himself with the arrogant confidence of someone used to getting his way. Mark set down his axe and moved to stand near the porch as the stranger dismounted. The man's smile was slick as oil. "Mrs. Kincaid," he said, tipping his hat. "Mr. Redmond of the Western Pacific Railroad Company." His eyes slid dismissively over Mark's plain clothes. "And you must be the new husband I've heard about." Chloe lifted her chin. "State your business, Mr. Redmond." Redmond reached into his saddlebag and withdrew a leather folder. "Just some matters requiring your attention, ma'am." He extracted several official-looking papers. "It seems your late husband left some outstanding debts." "That's impossible," Chloe snapped. "Thomas paid every bill. This land is mine, free and clear." "The documentation suggests otherwise." Redmond's smile never wavered as he held out the papers. "The railroad has acquired these debt notes. We intend to exercise our right to claim this property, including the spring that runs through it." The color drained from Chloe's face. That spring was the lifeblood of her ranch, the reason Thomas had chosen this land in the first place. Mark stepped forward, his quiet voice steady. "We'll need time to review these claims properly." Redmond's laugh held no warmth. "Review all you like. Marrying a pauper won't protect you, Mrs. Kincaid. The railroad always gets what it wants." He mounted his horse with practiced ease. "You have 1 week to vacate the premises." They watched him ride away, dust settling in his wake. Chloe's hands trembled as she gripped the papers he'd left. "He's lying," she whispered. "Thomas would never." Her voice broke. Mark touched her arm gently. "Show me where you keep the deed and any other documents." Chloe led him inside to her bedroom. From beneath her bed, she pulled out a battered trunk. Inside lay years of carefully preserved papers, deeds, receipts, letters. Mark sat cross-legged on the floor, methodically examining each one while Chloe paced. The afternoon light was fading when Mark finally looked up, holding a yellowed document. "Here," he said, "the original land grant." Chloe knelt beside him as he pointed to a carefully worded clause. "Water rights shall be preserved for the widow so long as she remains legally wed and maintains residence upon said property." "What does it mean?" Chloe asked, though understanding was already dawning in her eyes. "It means they can't take the spring while you're married and living here," Mark explained. "Thomas protected you, and the land, with this clause." Chloe sank back against the bed frame, laughing without humor. "So you really were my last chance," she said. "When I offered that mad bargain with the horse, I had no idea." "Providence works in mysterious ways," Mark said softly. Their eyes met across the scattered papers. For the first time, Chloe looked at Mark not as someone she'd hired with a desperate bargain, but as a true partner in the fight ahead. His steady presence and quiet strength suddenly seemed like more than chance. "The railroad won't give up easily," she warned. Mark nodded, gathering the documents carefully. "No," he agreed, "but neither will we." They spent the evening organizing the papers, building their case. The lamp burned low as they worked side by side, their shoulders occasionally brushing. Outside, a whippoorwill called into the gathering darkness. Neither spoke of the change taking place between them, how desperation's bargain was slowly transforming into something deeper, something real. When Chloe finally rose to retire, she paused in her doorway. "Thank you," she said simply, "for staying, for helping." Mark looked up from the documents, his face gentle in the lamplight. "Where else would I be? This is my home now, too." Chloe nodded, unable to speak past the sudden tightness in her throat. She closed her door softly, leaving it unlatched for the first time since their wedding night. Through the crack, she could see Mark still bent over the papers, his shadow tall against the wall. The railroad might have power and money on their side, she thought, but they didn't understand the strength that could grow between two people who chose to stand together. She closed her eyes, feeling not just fear now, but hope, and something else she wasn't ready to name. The morning sun cast long shadows across the yard as Mark saddled their horses. Chloe emerged from the house wearing her best dress, though the fabric was worn thin at the elbows. She carried a leather folder clutched tight against her chest, filled with the precious documents they had gathered the night before. Mark helped her mount without comment, his strong hands steady at her waist. The gesture felt different now, less like strangers forced together by circumstance and more like partners facing a common fight. They rode side by side toward town, hooves raising dust from the dry trail. The street was busy when they arrived, wagons creaking past the mercantile while ranch hands loitered outside the saloon. Heads turned as Mark and Chloe dismounted in front of the courthouse. Whispers followed them up the wooden steps. "Ain't that the widow who bought herself a husband? Wonder how long that'll last." Chloe's chin lifted higher with each muttered comment. Mark walked beside her, his quiet presence like a shield against the gossip. Inside the courthouse, cool shadows wrapped around them. The county clerk, Mr. Peterson, peered at them over wire-rimmed spectacles. "Mrs. Kincaid," he said, then corrected himself. "Mrs. Yoder, I should say. What brings you in today?" "We need to review some documents," Chloe said, laying the folder on his desk. "Regarding our water rights." Peterson's eyebrows rose at the word "our," but he said nothing as he began examining the papers. The morning light streaming through dusty windows made the ink glow golden on the yellowed pages. They had been there perhaps an hour when the courthouse door swung open. Mr. Redmond strode in, his boots clicking against the wooden floor. His smile was sharp as a knife's edge. "Ah, just as I expected," he said. "Trying to delay the inevitable, Mrs. Kincaid?" "The name is Yoder now," Chloe replied. Her voice carried clearly through the quiet room. "And we're here to protect what's rightfully ours." Redmond's smile didn't waver. This marriage of convenience won't hold up under proper scrutiny. A desperate bargain struck over a horse. He laughed softly. No judge will consider that a true union. Mark remained silent, but his hand found Chloe's elbow, offering quiet support. She straightened, drawing strength from his touch. "He is my husband," she declared, her voice ringing with sudden pride. "And this is our ranch." The word "our" seemed to hang in the air between them. The land grant specifically protects a widow's water rights as long as she remains legally wed and living on the property. "We are legally wed, Mr. Redmond, whatever you might think of our match." The clerk nodded slowly, adjusting his spectacles. "The lady speaks true. This marriage, however unconventional, appears properly registered, and the water rights clause is quite clear." Redmond's face darkened. "This isn't over," he warned, turning on his heel. The door slammed behind him, making the windows rattle. They spent another hour with the clerk, ensuring every document was properly recorded. By the time they emerged, the sun was sinking toward the mountains. They rode home in companionable silence, both weary from the day's tensions. Chloe disappeared into the kitchen as soon as they arrived, the familiar sounds of cooking soon filling the house. Mark tended to the horses, then washed up at the pump outside. When he entered the kitchen, he found a proper supper laid out. Beef stew, fresh bread, even apple pie. They ate quietly at first, the clink of spoons against bowls the only sound. Then Chloe set down her spoon and looked at Mark directly. "Tell me about Pennsylvania," she said softly, "about your family there." Mark's hand stilled on his bread. For a long moment he said nothing. When he spoke, his voice was low but clear. "We had 40 acres, he began. Not much by some standards, but it was good land. My father worked it his whole life. My mother kept a garden that could feed half the county." He smiled faintly at the memory. But 3 bad years in a row, drought, then floods, then blight in the wheat, it was too much. The bank wouldn't wait any longer. Chloe listened intently, her usual sharp edges softened by the lamplight and his quiet words. "My mother." Mark's voice caught slightly. "She prayed every night, even when we knew we'd lose the farm. Said the Lord would show us a path if we just kept faith." He traced a pattern on the tablecloth. "When I heard about work out west, she told me to go. Said sometimes the path forward means leaving home behind." "Do you write to her?" Chloe asked. Mark nodded. "Every month. Though I haven't told her yet about—" He gestured vaguely between them. "About your desperate wife who traded a horse for a husband?" Chloe's voice held a hint of her usual bite. But there was something else there too. Uncertainty, perhaps even vulnerability. "About how the Lord works in mysterious ways," Mark corrected gently, "leading me to a place where I might be needed." Chloe looked away, blinking rapidly. She rose and began clearing the dishes with unnecessary force. Mark helped quietly, and soon the kitchen was set to rights. As the evening deepened into night, they moved through their usual routine. Mark read from his Bible by lamplight, while Chloe darned socks in her rocking chair. But something had shifted between them, like earth settling after a storm. When Chloe rose to retire, she paused in her doorway. "If you wish to pray inside," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "you may." Mark looked up, his face gentle in the lamplight. He followed her into the bedroom, keeping a respectful distance. Chloe knelt beside her bed, her hands clasped tight. Mark knelt too, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him, but not touching. "Lord," Mark began, his voice soft but steady, "we ask for strength in the days ahead, for wisdom to protect what you have given us to steward, for guidance on this path you've set before us. And for understanding," Chloe added, her voice trembling slightly, "of your purpose in bringing us together." "Amen," they whispered together. Mark rose quietly and moved toward the door. He paused there, looking back at Chloe still kneeling by her bed. "Sleep well," he said softly. "You too," she replied. He pulled the door nearly closed as he left, but Chloe made no move to latch it. Through the narrow gap, she could hear him settling into his bedroll in the main room. The familiar sound was oddly comforting now, like the cricket songs drifting through her window or the distant cry of coyotes in the hills. She climbed into bed, her mind full of Pennsylvania farms and mother's prayers and the steady presence of a man who had come west with nothing but faith. The door remained ajar, letting in a thin slice of lamplight from where Mark read his Bible, keeping watch in the darkness beyond. The morning sun painted the mountains gold as Mark hitched the borrowed oxen to the plow. Their massive shoulders gleamed with early sweat, steam rising from their backs in the cool dawn air. He'd traded 3 days of fence mending with neighbor Jenkins for use of the team. The field before him stretched long and neglected. Chloe's land had lain fallow since her first husband's passing. "Mind they don't pull too hard left," Chloe called from the porch, a basket of seed potatoes at her feet. "That near ox favors his right foot." Mark nodded, adjusting the reins. Much obliged for the warning. He clicked his tongue, and the oxen leaned into their harness. The plow bit deep, turning over rich, dark earth that hadn't seen sun in years. As the morning wore on, Chloe worked behind him, dropping potato eyes into the freshly turned furrows. The steady rhythm of their labor filled the air. The creak of leather harness, the oxen's heavy breathing, the soft thud of potatoes hitting soil. Mark's shirt grew damp with honest work, and he found himself humming an old Amish hymn. Near midday, the ground turned treacherous where winter melt had pooled. Mark's boot slipped suddenly in the mud, and he stumbled, arms windmilling for balance. Behind him, a sound he hadn't heard before rang out. Chloe's laugh, rich and genuine. "Land's sake, Mark Yoder," she called out. "You look like a newborn colt finding its legs." Instead of taking offense, Mark grinned back at her, wiping mud from his hands. "Reckon I do at that." His easy acceptance of her teasing seemed to surprise her, and her laugh softened into something warmer. They broke for dinner at noon, sharing bread and cold chicken in the shade of an old cottonwood. Chloe had brought a jug of fresh well water, and they passed it back and forth, the simple act feeling somehow intimate. "Never thought I'd see this field planted again," Chloe said quietly, looking out over the morning's work. The newly turned earth stretched in neat furrows, dotted with the promise of potatoes. "Good land shouldn't lie idle," Mark replied. "The Lord gives us soil to tend." Chloe nodded, then stood briskly, brushing crumbs from her skirt. "Well then, let's tend it proper. I've got bean seeds soaking, ready to plant." The afternoon passed in shared labor. Mark continued with the plow while Chloe worked the already turned soil, pressing bean seeds into the earth with practiced hands. The sun tracked across the sky, and the field slowly transformed from neglected pasture to promising cropland. As evening approached, they sat together on the porch steps watching the sunset paint the mountains purple. The day's work had left them tired but satisfied. From the kitchen came the homey smell of beans simmering with salt pork. "Supper's about ready," Chloe said, rising with only a small grunt of effort. Her usual sharp edges seemed softened by honest fatigue. Inside, the kitchen glowed warm with lamplight. They sat at the table together, passing cornbread and beans back and forth. The silence between them was comfortable now, punctuated by the clink of spoons and the occasional comment about tomorrow's work. "Thought we might ride to town Saturday," Chloe said, sopping up bean juice with a piece of cornbread. "Running low on flour and coffee." Mark nodded. "The plow team goes back to Jenkins tomorrow. I could see about borrowing them again next week." "Might be worth looking into buying our own," Chloe said, then seemed startled by her own use of our. She covered it quickly. "That is, if we're to keep working the land proper." "We are," Mark said simply, and the way he said "we" made it sound like a promise. Saturday dawned clear and cool. They rode into town together, Chloe on her bay mare and Mark on the roan gelding that had been his bride price. The town was busy with weekend traffic, wagons arriving for supplies, ranch hands coming in for entertainment, families heading to church services. The whispers still followed them, but they seemed to have lost their bitter edge. Several people nodded respectfully as they passed. Old Mrs. Henderson even stopped them outside the church. "Saw smoke from your chimney early Thursday," she said to Chloe. "Reminded me of how it used to be when your place was working proper." "We've been busy," Chloe replied, and again that word "we" seemed to come naturally to her now. At the mercantile, Mark loaded their supplies while Chloe settled the bill. A boy of about 12 lingered near the woodpile, watching Mark work. His clothes were patched and worn, his shoes clearly too small. "Need any help, mister?" the boy asked, trying to sound casual but hunger clear in his voice. "I'm good with an axe." Mark studied him thoughtfully. "What's your name, son?" "Elias, sir. My sister Ruth's over there." He pointed to a small girl huddled on the mercantile steps, perhaps 8 or 9 years old. "Where are your folks?" Mark asked gently. Elias's face closed up. "Fever took them last winter. We've been making do." Chloe had come up behind them, hearing the exchange. Her expression softened as she looked at the two children. "Making do how?" "Odd jobs, ma'am. I can split wood, tend horses. Ruth helps at the laundry sometimes." His chin came up proudly. "We ain't begging." "No," Chloe said quietly. "I can see that you ain't." She looked at Mark, something unspoken passing between them. Then she turned back to Elias. "When did you two eat last?" The boy shrugged, trying to look unconcerned, but his hollow cheeks told their own story. Chloe marched back into the mercantile, returning moments later with bread, cheese, and 2 apples. The children's eyes grew wide, but they waited for her nod before falling on the food. The ride home was quiet, both Mark and Chloe lost in thought. The spring evening was settling in as they sat together on the porch, as had become their habit. Crickets chirped in the grass, and somewhere in the distance a whippoorwill called. Chloe's hands were busy with mending, but her mind seemed elsewhere. Finally, she set down her needle and looked at Mark directly. "Did you ever think about having children?" she asked, her voice carefully neutral. "Back in Pennsylvania, I mean." Mark was silent for a long moment, his face thoughtful in the gathering dusk. "Yes," he said finally, "though I never spoke of it much. Didn't seem right, with the farm failing." "And now?" Chloe's voice was barely above a whisper. Mark turned to look at her, his eyes gentle in the fading light. "If God wills it," he said softly. Chloe nodded, picking up her mending again, but her hands trembled slightly as she pushed the needle through the fabric. "Those children today," she said after a while, "they need more than odd jobs and mercantile scraps." "They do," Mark agreed quietly. The crickets sang into the darkness, and the stars began to appear one by one above the mountains. Neither spoke again, but the silence between them was full of unspoken possibilities, like seeds waiting in fertile soil. Later, as they prepared for bed, Chloe paused in her doorway. "Thank you," she said suddenly. "For what?" Mark asked. for making this feel like a home again, for working the land like it matters, for... She gestured vaguely, encompassing everything that had changed between them. For being a true partner, even if we started with a horse trade. Mark's smile was gentle in the lamplight. Thank you for giving me land to tend and purpose to serve. They held each other's gaze for a moment longer than usual before Chloe disappeared into her room. The door remained ajar, as it had every night since they'd prayed together. In the main room, Mark knelt for his evening prayers, his heart full of gratitude for the mysterious ways the Lord worked, turning a desperate bargain into something that felt more and more like blessing with each passing day. The week that followed their conversation about the orphans brought a gentle rhythm to the ranch. Each morning, Mark and Chloe worked side by side, their movements falling into an easy harmony. The newly planted field showed promise, tiny green shoots pushing through the dark soil like hope made visible. In the evenings, after the day's work was done, they sat together in the lamp-lit kitchen. The wooden table between them no longer felt like a barrier, but rather a shared space, marked with the honest wear of meals and conversation. "Pass the butter, please," Chloe would say, and their fingers would brush as Mark handed over the dish. Small moments, but they carried weight. Each night, when the dishes were cleared and the kitchen put to rights, Mark would take out his worn Bible. The leather cover was soft with use, the pages marked with his father's neat notations in German. Chloe no longer retreated to her room but stayed, hands busy with mending as Mark's voice filled the quiet house. "A wise woman builds her house," he read one evening from Proverbs, his voice steady and sure. "But with her own hands, the foolish one tears hers down." Chloe's needle paused mid-stitch. The lamplight caught the silver threading through her dark hair, and something in her face softened as she listened. "I reckon I've done my share of tearing down," she said quietly, more to herself than to Mark. He looked up from the Bible, his eyes gentle. "The Lord gives us time to rebuild." Later, as they prepared for bed, Chloe left her door open wide. She knelt beside her bed, and Mark joined her, their voices mingling in evening prayer. The familiar words felt different now, warmed by shared faith and growing trust. But peace, like spring weather in the mountains, can change in an instant. The next afternoon, while Mark repaired a loose board on the barn door, dust rose on the road. 3 riders approached, Redmond in his city suit, flanked by the sheriff and his deputy. Chloe came out of the house, wiping her hands on her apron. She felt a chill despite the warm day. Redmond dismounted first, his boots raising small clouds in the yard. His face was flushed with anger, his usual smooth manner cracked. "The county clerk has no right to delay our claim," he snapped, not bothering with pleasantries. "And you, sir," he jabbed a finger at Mark, "have been seen trespassing on railroad survey land." Mark set down his hammer carefully. "I've stayed within our property lines." "That's not what my witnesses say." Redmond gestured, and 2 men rode up from behind the barn, ranch hands Chloe recognized from town, known for their loose relationship with truth. The sheriff shifted uncomfortably in his saddle. "These men have signed statements, Mark. Say they saw you tampering with survey stakes out by 3 Creek Junction." "That's a lie." Chloe's voice cracked like a whip. "Mark hasn't left this ranch except to go to town with me." "Ma'am." The sheriff touched his hat, apologetic but firm. "I've got sworn testimony here. Have to take him in, at least until we sort this out." Mark stood very still, his face calm though his shoulders were taut with tension. "The Lord knows the truth of it." "The Lord won't help you in county court," Redmond sneered. He turned to the sheriff. "Arrest him." "Mark." Chloe moved forward, but Mark held up his hand. "It's all right, Chloe." His voice was steady, though his eyes held worry. Not for himself, she realized, but for her. "Truth will stand." The deputy produced handcuffs, the metal gleaming dully in the afternoon sun. Mark offered his wrists without resistance, his dignity a rebuke to Redmond's satisfaction. "Mark, please," Chloe's voice shook. "Don't let them take you." He turned to her, chains clinking softly. "Trust the Lord," he said quietly, "as I trust him." The sheriff helped Mark into the waiting wagon. Chloe watched, trembling, as they secured him to the bench. The sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the scene in shades of blood and gold. "I'll send someone for the livestock," Redmond called over his shoulder as they rode away, "since you won't be able to manage alone." Chloe stood in the yard long after the dust had settled, watching until the wagon disappeared around the bend. The ranch felt suddenly vast and empty, the silence pressing in like a physical thing. Inside the house, shadows gathered in the corners. The kitchen, so lately warmed by shared meals and quiet conversation, echoed with absence. Mark's Bible still lay on the table where he'd left it that morning, open to Proverbs. Chloe moved through the rooms like a ghost, touching things Mark had mended. The loose floorboard now firm under her feet, the window that no longer stuck, the chair that didn't wobble. His presence was everywhere, in all the small repairs that had made the house whole again. She stopped in her bedroom doorway. The bed was neatly made, the quilt smooth, her mother's wedding gift, carefully stored until Mark had fixed the leak in the roof over her cedar chest. Now it brightened the room with its patterns of red and gold like sunset caught in cloth. Slowly, Chloe sank to her knees beside the bed. Her hands, usually so capable, clutched at the quilt's familiar patterns. Words came then, rusty with disuse but urgent with need. "Lord," she whispered into the gathering dark. "Lord, please." Her voice broke. "I know I ain't been much for praying these past years. Been too busy being bitter, I reckon. But Lord, he's a good man, a righteous man. Don't let them hurt him." Tears fell onto the quilt, darkening the fabric. "Please," she continued, her voice stronger now. "I ain't asking for myself. Though truth be told, Lord, I need him too. Need him more than I thought possible. But he deserves better than jail on false charges. He deserves—" She stopped, overwhelmed by the realization of all Mark deserved. Respect, kindness, love freely given. All the things she'd been too afraid to offer. "Lord," she prayed again, "give me strength to help him. Show me the way. And—" She hesitated, then pressed on. "If you see fit to bring him home to me, I promise to be the wife he deserves. The wife he's been faithful to, even when I locked my door against him." The room was fully dark now, but Chloe remained on her knees, praying with a passion she hadn't felt since she was a girl. She prayed until her legs cramped and her voice grew hoarse. She prayed for Mark's safety, for justice to prevail, for guidance in the days ahead. Finally, exhausted, she climbed into bed. The house creaked and settled around her, its familiar sounds now lonely without Mark's evening prayers echoing through the walls. She left her door open wide, though there was no one to see it. "Bring him home," she whispered into the darkness. "Please, Lord, bring him home." The night stretched long before her, filled with prayers and promises, while somewhere in the town jail, Mark knelt on a cold floor, his own prayers rising like incense in the darkness. Dawn painted the mountains gold, but Chloe barely noticed the beauty. She saddled her horse with trembling hands, her movements quick and anxious. The mare sensed her distress, dancing sideways as Chloe mounted. "Steady now," she murmured, patting the horse's neck. The words caught in her throat. They were Mark's words, his gentle way with animals. The ride into town stretched longer than usual. Every hoofbeat seemed to echo her worry. The streets were quiet when she arrived, most folks being at breakfast. A few early risers paused their sweeping to stare as she passed. Chloe kept her eyes forward, though her cheeks burned. The jail was a squat wooden building near the sheriff's office. Chloe tied her horse at the post, noting how the mare's head drooped. The poor beast had carried her at a faster pace than usual. Inside, the air hung heavy with pipe smoke and stale coffee. The deputy looked up from his desk, his expression carefully blank. "Ma'am," he nodded. "Come to see your husband?" "Yes." Chloe's voice was stronger than she felt. "I've brought him fresh clothes." The deputy led her down a short hallway to the cells. Mark sat on a narrow cot, his Bible open on his lap. Even here he maintained his dignity. His clothes were neat despite the night in jail, his bearing straight and calm. "Chloe." He stood as she approached, moving to the bars. His face was weary, dark circles beneath his eyes suggesting a sleepless night, but his smile was genuine. "Mark?" She gripped the iron bars, fighting the urge to cry. Have they treated you well? Well enough. He covered her hand with his own through the bars. His palm was warm and calloused from honest work. Do not lose faith, he said softly, his voice steady and sure. The Lord sees all things. Footsteps echoed in the hallway, accompanied by a familiar laugh that made Chloe's spine stiffen. Redmond appeared, immaculate in his city suit despite the early hour. Well, well, he drawled. If it isn't the grieving wife come to visit your purchased groom? Chloe felt the old shame rise up hot and bitter. Her size had always been a target for cruel tongues, and Redmond knew exactly where to strike. A horse for a husband, he continued, circling closer. Though I suppose beggars can't be choosers, on either side of that bargain. Mark's hand tightened over Chloe's. Mr. Redmond, he said quietly, your quarrel is with me. Leave my wife be. Wife? Redmond snorted. A marriage of convenience, nothing more. Everyone knows she bought you with that broken-down gelding. The words struck like physical blows. Chloe wanted to shrink away, to hide as she had so many times before. But Mark's touch anchored her, his strength flowing through their joined hands. I'll bring more clothes tomorrow, she told Mark, holding her head high despite the tremor in her voice. And your other Bible, the German one. Thank you. His eyes held hers, full of concern, not for himself, but for her. Remember what we read together? Commit thy way unto the Lord. She nodded, unable to speak past the tightness in her throat. Reluctantly, she withdrew her hand from his and turned to leave. Run along now, Redmond called after her. Though with your size, I suppose waddling is more accurate. Chloe's steps didn't falter, though tears threatened. She collected her horse and rode toward the church, where the Sunday morning service would soon begin. Perhaps there, she thought, she might find some peace. The church bell rang as she approached, its clear tone carrying across the town. Townspeople streamed toward the white clapboard building, dressed in their Sunday best. Chloe tied her horse beside the others and smoothed her skirts, conscious of the dust from her morning ride. Inside, the familiar scents of beeswax candles and old hymnals wrapped around her. She slipped into a back pew, trying to make herself small, a lifetime's habit for a woman of her size. But the whispers followed her like wasps. Did you hear? Her husband's in jail. Well, what did she expect buying a man with a horse? Probably stole something. You know how those Pennsylvania Dutch are. Shush, she'll hear you. Let her hear. Pride goes before a fall, they say. The words burrowed under her skin like thorns. The preacher's voice faded to a distant drone as more whispers reached her ears. She gripped the hymnal until her knuckles went white, but still the cruel comments came. Never should have married him. Desperate woman. Probably glad to be rid of her. A sob built in Chloe's chest, too big to contain. She stood abruptly, her movement drawing every eye in the church. Without a word, she fled down the aisle and out the heavy wooden doors. In the churchyard, sunshine mocked her tears. She stumbled to a bench beneath an old oak tree, its shade offering small comfort. Her body shook with released grief as she wept, for Mark's imprisonment, for her own shame, for all the years of mockery she'd endured. The church doors opened and closed as the service continued within. Hymns drifted out, their familiar melodies twisted now by memory of those whispered words. Chloe remained on her bench until the final notes faded and people began to emerge. She kept her face turned away as they passed, though she felt their stares. A few paused, perhaps considering offering comfort, but moved on when she showed no sign of welcoming company. Soon, the churchyard emptied, leaving her alone with her tears and the gentle rustle of oak leaves above. The ride home was a blur. Her horse, sensing her distress, picked its way carefully along the familiar trail. The ranch house came into view as afternoon shadows lengthened across the yard. It looked empty now, bereft of Mark's steady presence. Inside, the kitchen held too many reminders. Mark's chair sat empty at the table, his place setting untouched. The coffee pot he'd scrubbed to gleaming stood cold on the stove. Even the repairs he'd made seemed to mock her. The fixed window latch, the mended floorboards, all speaking of his careful attention to her comfort. Chloe moved through her evening chores like a sleepwalker. She fed the animals but couldn't bring herself to eat, though she'd missed both breakfast and dinner. Instead, she sat at the kitchen table, staring at Mark's empty chair while darkness gathered in the corners. Outside, coyotes began their nightly chorus. Their wild voices seemed to echo her own despair, rising and falling in mournful harmony. The sound had frightened her once, in the early days of her widowhood. Now it felt fitting, nature's lament for her solitude. "Commit thy way unto the Lord," she whispered into the darkness, tasting salt on her lips. The words felt different now, not just Mark's prayer but her own. They carried weight, like a rope thrown to a drowning woman. She repeated them, letting their rhythm steady her breathing. "Commit thy way unto the Lord." Each repetition seemed to strengthen her, building something new in place of her broken pride. The moon rose, casting silver light through the windows Mark had washed so carefully. Chloe remained at the table, prayer beads slipping through her fingers as she whispered the words again and again. They belonged to her now, these fragments of faith Mark had shared so freely. In the distance, the coyotes sang their wild hymns to the night sky. But Chloe was no longer listening to their lonely song. Her lips moved in constant prayer, each word a small defiance against despair, each breath drawing her closer to the faith Mark had never lost. "Commit thy way unto the Lord," she prayed, and felt something shift inside her, like a key turning in a long rusted lock, like dawn breaking over the mountains, like hope taking root in fertile soil. 3 days crawled past like molasses in winter. Chloe moved through her chores mechanically, the empty ranch house echoing with each footstep. The morning sun had just cleared the mountains when she heard hoofbeats approaching. Her heart leaped, hoping for news about Mark, but instead she recognized the steady gait of Indian ponies. Greyhawk led his family down the rutted path to her door, their horse's breath steaming in the cool morning air. The elder's face was grave as he dismounted, his movements deliberate with age and dignity. Chloe hurried out to meet them, wiping her hands on her apron. "Welcome," she said, inclining her head respectfully. "Please, come inside where it's warm." Greyhawk nodded, speaking in measured tones. "We bring words of truth about your husband." Chloe's hands trembled as she ushered them into her kitchen. The room felt smaller with their presence, but their familiar faces brought comfort rather than crowding. She stirred the cooking pot hanging over the hearth where a simple stew had been simmering since dawn. "I saw your man," Greyhawk said, settling onto a wooden chair. "He worked your land proper, fixing fences on your side of the markers. The railroad men speak with forked tongues." Relief flooded through Chloe's body. You saw this yourself?" "With these eyes." Greyhawk touched his weathered face. "I will speak to the judge. Our people know truth from lies, though the white man's court does not always listen." Tears welled in Chloe's eyes as she ladled stew into tin bowls. Her hands shook so badly that drops splashed onto the table. "I don't know how to thank you." Greyhawk's wife, her silver-streaked hair bound in neat braids, reached out to steady Chloe's hands. "We remember your late husband's honest dealings, and we see how this new one works with respect for the land." Their youngest son, no more than 12, spoke up eagerly. "I watched him fix the fence by the creek. He stopped to help a rabbit caught in wire. Didn't even take it for food." Chloe smiled through her tears, remembering Mark's gentle ways with animals. She served them the humble meal, grateful they accepted it without comment on its simplicity. They ate together in comfortable silence, broken only by the clink of spoons and the occasional crackle from the hearth. As the afternoon light began to fade, thunder rolled in the distance. Greyhawk and his family prepared to leave before the storm broke. At the door, he turned to Chloe one last time. "We will come when the judge calls. The truth must be spoken." Chloe watched them ride away, their horses' hooves kicking up dust that the approaching storm would soon settle. Hope had taken root in her heart, as sturdy as the seedlings Mark had planted in their vegetable patch. The storm was gathering force when another visitor appeared. Through the growing gloom, Chloe recognized Preacher Davidson's slight figure hurrying toward her door. He clutched his hat against the rising wind, his usual confident stride replaced by uncertain steps. "Mrs. Kincaid," he called out. using her married name with unusual emphasis. "Might I have a word?" Chloe invited him inside just as the first heavy drops began to fall. The preacher stood awkwardly in her kitchen, twisting his hat in his hands. His face was drawn with what looked like inner torment. "I've come to confess something," he said finally, his voice barely audible above the rain now drumming on the roof. "Something that weighs heavy on my conscience." Chloe gestured for him to sit, but he remained standing as if his guilt wouldn't allow him rest. "What is it, preacher?" "The railroad." He swallowed hard. "They paid me to expedite their land claims, to push their deeds through quickly, without proper scrutiny." The words hung in the air between them. Chloe gripped the back of a chair, her knuckles white. "You took their money?" "To my shame, yes." His shoulders sagged. "They said it was just to speed up necessary paperwork. But now, seeing what they're doing to you and Mark..." He lifted his eyes to meet hers. "I can't keep silent anymore." Lightning flashed outside, illuminating the kitchen in stark white. In that brief moment, Chloe saw the preacher's face clearly, the deep lines of remorse, the desperate need for absolution. "Will you testify?" she asked, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "Will you tell the judge what you know?" "Yes." The word seemed to cost him physical pain. "It's time for the truth to come out. All of it." They spent the next hour planning, their voices nearly drowned by the storm's fury. The preacher knew details about the railroad schemes that made Chloe's blood run cold. Forged documents, threatened witnesses, stolen water rights. But his testimony, combined with Greyhawk's, might be enough to free Mark and save their land. When the storm finally passed, the preacher left with lighter steps, as if unburdened. Chloe watched him go, marveling at how the Lord worked in mysterious ways, bringing help from unexpected quarters. The next morning dawned clear and cool. Chloe rose before sunrise to bake bread, kneading the dough with purpose. The familiar work calmed her spirit as she thought about the growing circle of allies standing with them against the railroad's greed. She waited until the loaves were golden brown before wrapping them carefully in clean cloth. The morning was well advanced by the time she hitched up her wagon for the drive into town. The jail looked less forbidding in the bright sunshine, though her heart still clenched at the sight of the barred windows. The deputy nodded to her as she entered, more courteous than usual. Perhaps word of the preacher's confession had already spread. She found Mark sitting on his narrow cot, reading his well-worn Bible. He looked up as she approached, and his face brightened despite the shadows under his eyes. "I brought you fresh bread," she said, slipping the still warm package through the bars. The smell of it filled the small cell, a piece of home in this dreary place. Mark's smile was faint but genuine. "You are too kind to your humble husband." "Mark." She pressed closer to the bars, lowering her voice. "Greyhawk came yesterday. He saw you working our land properly. He'll testify for you." Hope flickered in Mark's tired eyes. The Lord provides witnesses. "And the preacher?" Chloe glanced around to ensure they were alone. "He's admitted to taking railroad money. He's willing to speak against them now." Mark broke off a piece of bread, considering this news. "We must pray for his courage. Such testimony will not be easy." "We'll fight together," Chloe whispered fiercely, surprising herself with the intensity of her words. "All of us, you, me, the Utes, the preacher, we'll stand against their lies." Mark reached through the bars to touch her hand, his fingers warm from the bread. "Together," he agreed softly, "with God's help." They shared a moment of silence, the morning light streaming through the high window painting bars of sunshine across the floor. In that peaceful instant, Chloe felt strength flowing between them, as real as the warmth of the fresh bread, as solid as the iron bars that separated them. "I should go," she said finally, reluctant to break the moment. "There's much to prepare for the hearing." Mark nodded, his face serene despite his imprisonment. "Remember what we read together? The truth shall make you free." Chloe carried those words with her as she left the jail, her steps firm and purposeful. The town bustled around her, but she barely noticed the usual stares and whispers. Her mind was focused on the tasks ahead, gathering documents, preparing their witnesses, building their case against the railroad schemes. The truth was finally coming to light, she thought, like the sun breaking through storm clouds. And with it came hope, as fresh and nourishing as the bread she'd baked that morning. They would fight this battle together, and with God's help they would prevail. The morning of the hearing dawned clear and cool. Dust motes danced in the early light streaming through the courthouse's high windows, settling on the rough wooden benches where townsfolk gathered. The clapboard building, usually reserved for minor disputes over cattle and property lines, now hummed with anticipation. Chloe sat rigid in the front row, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She had worn her best dress, faded but clean, and tied back her hair with special care. Around her, whispers rustled like dry leaves. A few sympathetic faces dotted the crowd, the mercantile owner's wife, some farmers who'd known her late husband, but most wore expressions of barely concealed curiosity or scorn. The judge, a weathered man named Harrison, sat behind his elevated desk, studying the papers before him through wire-rimmed spectacles. His face remained impassive as Mr. Redmond strode forward, resplendent in his tailored suit and polished boots. "Your Honor," Redmond began, his voice smooth as creekstones, "I present evidence that Mark Yoder trespassed on railroad property while conducting illegal surveys." He gestured to 3 men who sat near the front, their clothes suspiciously new. These witnesses saw him clearly. One by one, the men took the stand. Their stories matched perfectly, too perfectly, Chloe thought, her heart pounding. They described Mark crossing boundary lines, taking measurements, interfering with railroad equipment. Each testimony felt rehearsed like lines from a traveling show. Redmond smiled with satisfaction after each witness stepped down. "Furthermore," he continued, producing a stack of documents, "I have here proof of outstanding debts on the Kincaid property, debts which nullify any claim to water rights or land ownership." A murmur rippled through the courthouse. Chloe felt her chest tighten, but then movement near the door caught her attention. Greyhawk and his family entered silently, their presence commanding immediate notice. The whispers changed tone, became more uncertain. Greyhawk approached the judge's bench with quiet dignity, his son and wife behind him. He wore his finest clothes, a beaded vest over a clean white shirt, his long gray hair neatly braided. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of years and wisdom. "I have watched this land for many seasons," he began, gesturing toward Chloe. Her husband before, and now this new one, they respect the boundaries. The railroad men, they are the ones who cross where they should not. His son stepped forward next, speaking clearly despite his youth. "I saw Mark Yoder working on his own fence line, far from railroad land. He even stopped to free a rabbit from wire. A man who cares for small creatures does not steal from others." Greyhawk's wife nodded, adding her own testimony about the natural boundaries of the ranch, knowledge passed down through generations of her people. Their words rang with truth, unadorned and powerful. Redmond's face darkened. He started to object, but Judge Harrison raised his hand for silence. Into this tense moment, Preacher Davidson rose from his seat near the back. His steps were unsteady as he approached the front, and his voice quavered when he spoke. "Your Honor, I must confess something." The preacher's hands trembled as he gripped the wooden rail before the judge's bench. "I have sinned against God and this community." The courthouse fell so quiet that the creak of wooden boards beneath shifting feet seemed loud as gunshots. The preacher's face was pale, but determination showed in the set of his jaw. "The railroad paid me to hurry their paperwork through," he admitted, his voice growing stronger. "They gave me money to look the other way when documents weren't proper. I took it, to my shame." He turned to face the crowd, tears glinting in his eyes. "I ask forgiveness from God and from those I've wronged, especially you, Mrs. Kincaid, and your husband." Gasps and mutters filled the room. Judge Harrison leaned forward, his interest clearly piqued. "Are you willing to provide details of these payments, preacher?" "Yes, Your Honor, everything I know." For the next hour, the preacher detailed dates, amounts, and specific instances of railroad interference. He named names, produced receipts, and explained how legitimate claims had been undermined. With each revelation, Redmond's face grew darker. Finally, the judge turned to Chloe. "Mrs. Kincaid, do you have anything to add?" Chloe rose slowly, her legs shaking but her spine straight. She could feel every eye in the room upon her, but she focused only on the judge's patient face. "Mark is my husband," she began, her voice breaking slightly before finding its strength. "Our marriage may have started as a bargain, but it has become something true and honest." She paused, gathering her thoughts. "This ranch is our covenant, with each other and with the land. We work it fairly, respect our neighbors, and honor the treaties with the Ute people. The railroad seeks to take what isn't theirs, using lies and tricks to steal what honest folk have built." She gestured to the window where summer sunlight streamed in. "Out there, the land doesn't care about paper deeds or railroad profits. It cares about who tends it, who respects it, who makes it bloom. Mark and I, we're doing that together. This isn't just about property, Your Honor. It's about right and wrong, about keeping promises, about building something that matters." Judge Harrison nodded slowly, removing his spectacles to clean them with deliberate care. The courthouse remained hushed as he reviewed the documents before him one final time. The afternoon light had begun to slant when he finally looked up. "Having heard all testimony and examined the evidence, I find several things clear," he announced. "First, the railroad's witnesses have proven unreliable, while those speaking for the defense have shown consistency and character. Second, the preacher's confession reveals a pattern of corruption that casts doubt on all railroad claims in this matter. He lifted the original land grant. Most importantly, this document clearly states that widows' rights to the property and its water are preserved through legal marriage and continuous residence. Mrs. Kincaid has met both conditions through her marriage to Mark Yoder and their joint working of the ranch." The judge's gavel cracked against wood. "I rule in favor of the defendants. The ranch and its water rights remain with Mark and Chloe Yoder. Furthermore, I am ordering an investigation into the railroad's land acquisition practices in this county." He fixed Redmond with a stern gaze. "This court is adjourned." For a moment, silence held. Then cheers erupted from their supporters. Greyhawk and his family smiled quietly, while the preacher wiped tears from his eyes. Redmond stormed out, his face thunderous. But Chloe barely noticed any of this. Her attention was fixed on the sheriff unlocking the cell where Mark had been held. He stepped out into the late afternoon sunlight that poured through the courthouse doors, blinking slightly. His clothes were rumpled from days in jail, but his eyes were clear and calm. She stood waiting, suddenly uncertain. But Mark crossed the space between them with sure steps, taking her hand in his before all the watching faces. His palm was warm and calloused against hers, strong and gentle at once. "Thank you," he said softly, "for fighting for our home." Chloe felt tears spill down her cheeks, but she didn't try to hide them. For the first time in years, they were tears of joy, not sorrow. Around them, the courthouse slowly emptied, but they remained standing together, their joined hands a testament to a covenant that had grown stronger than either of them had imagined possible. Through the open doors, they could see their horses waiting patiently, ready to carry them back to the ranch, their ranch, where work and hope waited in equal measure. The afternoon sun painted everything in gold, promising tomorrow would dawn bright and clear on land that was truly their own. The roan gelding's hooves crunched softly on the path as Mark and Chloe rode home together. The setting sun painted the Colorado mountains in deep purple shadows, while wisps of clouds caught fire in shades of orange and red. Sharp, clean mountain air carried the scent of pine needles, making each breath feel like a blessing after the stuffy jail cell. They rode close, their horses' shoulders nearly touching. Neither spoke, but the silence between them held none of the tension of previous weeks. Instead, it felt like a delicate thing, precious and new, waiting to unfold in its own time. As they crested the last rise before their ranch, Chloe caught her breath. The humble buildings below were bathed in golden light, making even the weathered wood glow warm and welcoming. Smoke curled from the chimney where she'd banked the morning fire, and the newly mended fences stood straight and true against the darkening sky. "Home," Mark said softly, the word carrying all the weight of answered prayers. Chloe nodded, unable to speak past the tightness in her throat. Together, they guided their horses down the slope, the familiar creak of leather and jingle of bits a comfort after so many days of uncertainty. In the barn, they worked in easy harmony to unsaddle and brush down their mounts. Mark's hands were gentle as he checked his horse's hooves for stones, while Chloe measured out evening grain. The barn cats wound around their ankles, purring welcome as if nothing had changed. But everything had changed, and they both felt it in the air between them. When they stepped out into the yard, the first stars were beginning to appear in the deepening blue above. A cool evening breeze rustled the aspen leaves, carrying the lonely call of a whippoorwill from the distant trees. "I'll start supper," Chloe said, her voice barely above a whisper. Mark touched her elbow lightly. "I'll fetch fresh water and wood." Inside the kitchen, Chloe's hands trembled as she stirred up the banked coals and added kindling. The familiar motions of cooking usually steadied her, but tonight, everything felt different. She chopped vegetables for stew, carrots, potatoes, the last of the winter onions, while the kettle began to bubble. Through the window, she watched Mark at the woodpile, his strong arms swinging the axe in smooth, practiced strokes. How many times had she observed him working, pretending not to notice his quiet strength, his gentle ways? Now she let herself look openly, acknowledging the warmth that spread through her chest at the sight of him. The door creaked open as Mark entered with an armload of split wood and a bucket of fresh spring water. Without a word, he began setting the table, 2 tin plates, 2 cups, 2 spoons laid carefully side by side. The simple domestic scene brought tears to Chloe's eyes, which she blinked away hurriedly as she stirred the thickening stew. When supper was ready, they sat across from each other as they had so many times before. Steam rose from their bowls, carrying the savory scent of herbs and meat. Mark bowed his head to say, "Grace," and Chloe found herself watching his face instead of closing her eyes, the way his brow furrowed slightly in concentration, the gentle movement of his lips as he thanked the Lord for their food and their deliverance. They ate in silence for a while, but it wasn't the strained quiet of previous meals. This silence felt full of unspoken words, like a cup brimming with clear water, waiting to overflow. Chloe's spoon trembled slightly against her bowl as she gathered her courage. "I feared I wasn't worthy of love," she finally said, her voice barely audible above the tick of the cooling stove and the whisper of wind outside. Tears spilled down her cheeks before she could stop them. After Thomas died, the loneliness was bad enough, but the way people looked at me, spoke about me. She drew a shaky breath. "I thought if I could just keep the ranch, keep his memory alive somehow, it would be enough. I never expected." Her voice broke. Mark set down his spoon and stood slowly, his chair scraping softly against the wooden floor. He moved around the table with careful steps, as if approaching a nervous horse. When he reached her side, he gently lifted her hand from where it lay clenched beside her bowl. "The Lord gave me you, Chloe," he said, his voice rich with emotion. "Not the horse, not the land. You." She looked up at him through tear-blurred eyes, seeing the truth written plain on his honest face. All the walls she'd built around her heart crumbled in that moment, swept away by the tide of love in his gentle words. With a sob that was half laugh, half cry, she pulled him into her arms. He held her close, one hand stroking her hair, while the other pressed warm against her back. She buried her face in his chest, breathing in the clean scent of him, hay and sunshine and honest work. "I've been so afraid," she whispered against his shirt. "Afraid to believe this could be real." "I know," he murmured, his breath warm against her temple. "But faith isn't just for Sundays, Chloe. Sometimes it means believing in love when it comes in unexpected ways." She pulled back just enough to look up at him, seeing her own joy reflected in his eyes. His hand came up to cup her cheek, thumb gently wiping away her tears. With infinite tenderness, he bent to press his lips to her forehead. The lamp burned low as they finished their meal, casting warm shadows across the kitchen. Neither hurried to clear the dishes, both savoring this new closeness between them. When Mark finally rose to bank the fire for the night, Chloe felt none of her usual anxiety about bedtime approaching. They walked down the narrow hallway together, their footsteps in perfect rhythm. At her bedroom door, their bedroom door now, Chloe paused. Without hesitation or fear, she pushed it wide open, leaving no barrier between them. The small room was painted gold by lamplight, making everything soft and dreamlike. Mark's presence behind her was solid and real, a comfort rather than a threat. When she turned to face him, the love in his eyes made her feel beautiful for the first time in years. Together, they prepared for bed with the simple rituals of marriage, washing faces, changing into night clothes, saying evening prayers. When Mark slipped beneath the quilts beside her, Chloe felt only peace. His arm curved around her waist, drawing her close, and she rested her head on his shoulder as naturally as if they'd done this 1,000 times before. The lamp burned lower still, its gentle light warming the room like a blessing. Outside, a coyote called to its mate across the valley, and somewhere in the distance, another answered. Chloe smiled at the wild song, no longer feeling alone in the vastness of the frontier night. "Thank you," she whispered into the quiet, "for seeing past my thorns to find my heart." Mark's hand found hers beneath the quilts, their fingers intertwining. "Thank you for trusting me with it," he replied softly. As sleep began to steal over them, Chloe felt the last of her defenses melt away. Here, in the circle of her husband's arms, she was finally, truly home. The lamp flickered one last time and went out, but the darkness held no fear. Only the promise of tomorrow and all the tomorrows after, filled with the love they'd found in each other. The mountain snow retreated day by day, revealing tender green shoots beneath. Mark and Chloe watched winter melt into spring from their porch each morning, sharing coffee and quiet conversation as the sun rose over the eastern ridge. "Reckon it's time to start the spring planting," Mark said one crisp morning, his breath still visible in the cool air. Chloe nodded, her shoulder pressed warmly against his. They threw themselves into the work with shared purpose. Mark broke new ground for expanded vegetable gardens while Chloe prepared seed beds near the kitchen door. The earth was rich and dark, promising good yields. Together they repaired the barn's sagging roof, their hammers ringing in harmony across the awakening valley. Their weekly trips to town took on a different feel now. Where once there had been whispers and sneers, they found changing attitudes. Men who had once mocked now touched their hats as the couple passed. Women who had gossiped now offered tentative smiles. "Morning, Mrs. Yoder," called old Jim at the livery, using her married name with new respect. "That garden of yours coming along fine from what I hear." At the mercantile, Chloe loaded their wagon with more supplies than usual. Extra sacks of flour, beans, and sugar. Mark raised an eyebrow at the quantity, but said nothing. "We may need more than just for us," Chloe explained softly as they loaded the wagon. Her eyes drifted to where two ragged children peered hopefully into the candy jar through the store window. Mark followed her gaze and nodded, understanding in his eyes. "The Lord provides abundance to share," he said quietly. That evening, after supper was cleared away, they sat close together by the fire. The topic they'd both been considering finally found voice. "There are so many children in town without proper homes," Chloe said, her fingers working at her mending. "That boy who asked about splitting wood, and his sister." "Elias and Ruth," Mark supplied. He had learned their names from the preacher's wife. "The ranch is too quiet sometimes," Chloe continued, "and we have room enough." Mark reached over and took her hand, stilling her nervous movements. "The good book says to care for orphans and widows," he said. "Perhaps that's why the Lord brought us together. Not just for each other, but for them too." Chloe squeezed his hand, tears pricking at her eyes. "You truly wouldn't mind? Taking in children that aren't our own?" "Love makes family," Mark said simply. "Not just blood." A deep peace settled over Chloe's heart, as tangible as a warm hand on her shoulder. The ranch that had once been her lonely refuge now felt like it was waking up, preparing to welcome new life and laughter. The preacher's wagon rattled up to the ranch one bright spring morning. In the back, huddled close together, sat two children with faces pinched by hunger and loss. Their clothes hung in patches, and their eyes held shadows no young ones should know. "These here are Elias and Ruth," the preacher said softly. "Their parents." He trailed off, but Chloe and Mark understood. The fever had taken many that winter. 12-year-old Elias helped his 9-year-old sister down from the wagon, his protective stance speaking volumes. Ruth clutched a worn rag doll to her chest, her small fingers white-knuckled around its stuffed body. "Welcome, children," Chloe said, her voice gentler than Mark had ever heard it. "You must be hungry after your journey." In the kitchen, Chloe brought out fresh biscuits still warm from the morning's baking. She drizzled golden honey over them, watching as the children's eyes widened at such bounty. Ruth took delicate bites, while Elias devoured his portion as if afraid it might disappear. "There's plenty more," Chloe assured them, already reaching for the biscuit basket. "Eat your fill." After breakfast, Mark took them to the barn. "Would you like to meet Thunder?" he asked, leading out the roan gelding that had once been his marriage price. The horse lowered his head gently to the children's level. "Can I touch him?" Ruth whispered. At Mark's nod, she reached out a tentative hand. Thunder's soft nose tickled her palm, drawing out her first genuine smile. Elias proved a quick study with the curry brush, his serious expression lightening as Mark showed him how to groom the horse's gleaming coat. "You have a good hand with animals," Mark praised, and the boy stood straighter. Throughout the day, small sounds began filling the ranch house that had been quiet for so long. The patter of children's feet on wooden floors, Ruth's delighted giggle when Chloe showed her how to roll out dough, Elias's proud voice calling out that he'd filled the water bucket all by himself. When evening came, Chloe led them upstairs to 2 small bedrooms she'd kept ready, though empty, since Mark had arrived. Fresh quilts brightened the beds, and clean curtains fluttered at the windows. Ruth's eyes grew wide at having her own bed, while Elias ran a wondering hand over the soft pillow. After tucking the children in, Chloe found Mark in their bedroom. Outside, coyotes called their evening songs across the valley, but the sound no longer carried the edge of loneliness it once had. "This house feels alive again," Chloe confessed softly, sitting beside him on their bed. Mark smiled, laying his weathered hand over hers where it rested on the quilt. In the quiet, they could hear Ruth's gentle breathing from the next room, and Elias's slight snore, sounds of family, of home restored. Spring melted into summer, and the ranch bloomed with new life. Each morning, Mark led Elias and Ruth to the cornfield, where tender green shoots pushed through dark soil. His patient hands guided theirs as they dropped seeds into neat furrows. 3 kernels in each hole, he explained, demonstrating the proper spacing. Like the Trinity, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Ruth counted carefully while Elias took pride in making the rows straight as an arrow. The children's faces glowed with purpose, far different from the haunted looks they'd worn when arriving. Inside the house, Chloe's voice rang out clear and strong, teaching old hymns as she worked. Ruth's sweet soprano joined in, and even Elias hummed along while washing dishes. Amazing grace drifted through open windows, across fields where corn tassels danced in the breeze. On Sundays, their family filled an entire pew, no longer a place for cruel whispers about the widow who bought a husband. Instead, neighbors nodded respectfully at the flourishing family. Mark and Chloe's victory over the railroad had earned admiration, and Redmond's shame drove him to seek opportunities in Denver, far from the community he'd tried to destroy. One evening, as sunset painted the mountains gold, Greyhawk's family arrived with gifts of dried venison wrapped in clean cloth. Chloe welcomed them warmly, setting out her best cornbread and stew. Mark built a crackling campfire where both families gathered, sharing food and stories as stars emerged. Greyhawk's granddaughter, her eyes bright in the firelight, taught Chloe a Ute lullaby. The melody was strange at first to Chloe's ears, but beautiful, speaking of mothers, moonlight, and peace. She listened intently, repeating the foreign words until they felt natural on her tongue. Later that night, as she tucked Ruth and Elias into bed, Chloe hummed the Ute song softly. Ruth's eyes grew heavy, and even Elias relaxed into his pillow, the gentle tune carrying him toward dreams. In their own bedroom, Mark knelt for evening prayers, Chloe beside him. "Lord," he whispered, "you have blessed us beyond measure. You've made this ranch a place where your love bridges all divisions, between husband and wife, parent and child, neighbor and stranger. Thank you for showing us your kingdom here on earth." Chloe squeezed his hand, remembering the lonely widow she'd been, who'd offered a horse in desperate exchange for marriage. God had turned that bargain into something far richer, a true family, a home open to all who needed love's shelter. The evening sun painted the Colorado mountains in shades of purple and gold, casting long shadows across the transformed ranch. Where weeds once grew wild, neat rows of corn stretched toward the sky. The sagging barns now stood straight and true, their fresh-painted walls gleaming in the fading light. Around the supper table, Mark bowed his head, his voice gentle but firm. "Lord, you took 2 broken souls and made them whole." Elias and Ruth sat quietly, hands folded, while Chloe's fingers found marks beneath the tablecloth. Her heart swelled at the simple truth of his words. After the dishes were cleared, Mark and Chloe settled onto the porch steps. The air was sweet with summer grass and late-blooming wildflowers. In the yard, Elias chased Ruth, their laughter ringing clear as church bells across the evening air. "Can't catch me," Ruth called, her braids flying as she darted past the water pump. Chloe leaned against Mark's shoulder, remembering the bitter woman she'd been, the one who'd locked her door against love itself. "I locked the door once," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I never will again." Mark's lips brushed her forehead, tender as a prayer. Behind them, lamplight spilled from the windows of their home, no longer a place of loneliness and scorn, but a beacon of hope shining bright in the gathering dusk. Thank you for listening. Stories connect us in the most unexpected ways. If you felt that spark today, make sure you're subscribed. I share a new one daily, and the next might change your day.